I'm really happy to have with us today Eli Portella. They are currently an assistant professor in the Department of Communication and Philosophy at Florida Gulf Coast University, specializing in social and political philosophy, anti-colonial thought, feminist political philosophy, and critical theory. You can find their academic articles in journals such as Philosophy Today, Radical Philosophy Review, the Journal of Philosophy of History, Dissonancia, and other journals. And we read a chapter of their forthcoming book, Imperialism on the Brink, Decolonization, Decarbonization, and the Critique of Capitalism. So I'm going to turn it now over to Eli.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks everyone for being here and engaging this very much work in progress. If you had a chance to look over what was so generously provided to you all, what you looked over, for context, was an excerpt from the chapter. So the chapter is what you had a chance to look over, hopefully, was an excerpt from the chapter, which focuses on a debate in classical political economy, rather critical political economy, which, although I consider it a classic, is a little less discussed than its sort of progenitor, which is, if you're familiar with this area, the Brenner debate, sort of an elephant in the room in Marxist political economy. So my hope was that in exploring this debate, the chapter explores a number of other debates. Really, actually, it reviews all of what we call the transition debates. It starts all the way from the very early Dobbs-Sweezy debate and succeeds through a bunch, but we're focusing on the Brenner-Wallerstein debate. The hope was to address the sort of titular question of this talk. So in the slides, which I believe Gabriel is going to have up in just a moment for us, the titular question is, what's capitalist about capitalist imperialism? Now, the term capitalist imperialism is one that in the Marxist tradition we use very often, and generally speaking, it's one that we use, frankly, with a working definition. So in many ways, my sort of efforts in this chapter are to essentially establish a more sort of rigorous way of establishing what precisely is distinctly and uniquely capitalist about capitalist imperialism. So in a way, this too is about the transition debates, but the debate is not so much about the transition from, say, feudalism to capitalism or some other mode of production to capitalism, but rather from pre-capitalist imperialism to a distinctly capitalist imperialism. So just a sort of different valence of the transition debate. Now, in doing that, I found that the sort of most kind of expedient way to achieve this was to go back through those transition debates and ask myself, okay, where are sort of the points at which various thinkers are identifying how one mode of production is being demarcated from another, and so on, right? So naturally, coming to the Brenner-Wallerstein debate, I found myself saying, essentially there's kind of two approaches that are, competing for prominence, if you will. And in the chapter I sort of argued that, on the one hand you have what is largely, I think, a fairly conventional notion. If you've even sort of had a casual brush with Marxism, you've probably heard the word exploitation before. These are not new concepts. I'm not giving you any new information as of yet. And you're probably familiar with the idea that exploitation consists of something along the lines of, workers are essentially undercompensated. They produce more value than they're essentially receiving, and therefore, right, the sort of wrong-making, ill feature of capitalism is this feature, right? The problem with capitalism is that it is essentially exploitative toward workers. Now, I want to be really clear about something, because this is the moment where things go awry whenever I try to talk to someone about this intervention I'm trying to make. This is the very moment when things tend to go awry. I am not doing any of the following things, which is one, denying that this occurs. In fact, I am overwhelmingly certain that it occurs. And in fact, I'm certain that the overwhelming majority of, profit under capitalism is derived from this source, what we typically call surplus value in the technical sense. In fact, I'm convinced even that it comes from wage labor, from the exploitation of wage labor. I'm convinced that this is unjust and that it should be eliminated as quickly as possible. And I'm convinced that this is still the site of strategic and tactical importance. Class struggle, absolutely politically and tactically vital. This is not something we can ignore, including in relation to climate change, which, by the way, other big prong of the book. We're not really going to talk about that because this is about the theory of imperialism for today, but it's going to be in the background. However, what I do want to take issue with is the idea that the critique of exploitation can function in exclusivity as the basis of a comprehensive critique of capitalism, insofar as that critique of capitalism has to address itself to our two most pressing problems. Those two most pressing problems are the continued need for decolonization and the ever more demanding need for rapid decarbonization. My opinion, it's not an opinion, it's I think a well-reasoned view, my well-reasoned view is that a comprehensive critique of capitalism requires a very different kind of critique, one which is not exclusively reliant on the notion that the only ill or primary ill of capitalism is that it exploits workers, even if that is in fact true. No denial of the fact that that is true. So, the reason why I sort of want to hem and haw on this point, the reason why I want to emphasize it, is because in fact, critics of Marxism have exploited this theoretical ambivalence for a very long time. Now, they've often done so in very bad faith, so to be fair, we can probably brush off a lot of these criticisms as, misinterpretations. But oftentimes there's a kernel of truth. There are a lot of analytical imprecisions, not least of all those exhibited by Brenner in the chapter The Problems Abound, I think. And essentially these problems stem from what I perceive to be clear cases where the colonial context is in direct opposition to a description of capitalism as being characterized by wage-labor relations. If we say to ourselves that capitalism is constituted primarily, exclusively, specifically by the existence of wage-labor relations, and thereby its ill feature being wage-labor exploitation, then we functionally have to say colonialism is entirely analytically dependent of capitalism, which perhaps you're content with saying. I'm not. And I think probably a good number of people in the room would probably say we would have to ignore tremendous amounts of material, historical, and political conditions in order to say that. To the point of, frankly, I think justifiably being accused of some political naivety, wouldn't you say? So, given that we have to give some kind of account of the sort of historical continuity, the sort of transitional forms, the way in which capitalism appropriates a pre-existing historical form like imperialism, and transforms it for its own ends, we clearly have to have a better sense of what precisely those ends are, and moreover, right, what the sort of specific conditions are that we have to respond to. And those can be, right, chronological, right? Colonialism just chronologically predates capitalism, so that's problem one that critics, again, have exploited. Another, right, is that the colonial context is plagued by relations which are not wage relations, both prior to and after the advent of capitalism. Both prior to the advent of capitalism and after, throughout the colonies, we find that oftentimes the dominant relations are enslavement, bonded labor, indentured servitude, various other non-waged forms. Moreover, right, we find that colonial expropriation, dispossession, non-economic coercion continue to characterize, right, so much of economic production, even when the dominating power is a major capitalist power. Need I mention the empire upon which the sun never sets, namely the British Empire, right? The most hyper-capitalist empire to ever exist, by classical terms, right? Marx's own example, right, is clearly engaging in a massive undertaking called the Atlantic slave trade. So, finally, we come to sort of a last challenge, and for me, this is actually the biggest challenge. These are all, of course, morally significant challenges, but for the present day, I think this is the biggest problem, and that's the problem of underdevelopment. If you want to give a rigorous account of the notion of underdevelopment, why underdevelopment persists, and more importantly, like Marxist dependency theorists in Latin America, but also the Middle East and on the African continent have been trying to do for decades, if you want to give an account of why capitalism produces underdevelopment, you absolutely cannot do it by saying that the exclusive wrong of capitalism is that it exploits workers and extracts too much surplus value. Many people have tried. The exemplary case, well-intentioned, I might add. There's a lot about his work that's very admirable. Roimaro Marini is perhaps the exemplary case here, right? His whole notion of super-exploitation is to say, right, the reason that the colonies are underdeveloped is because we've been exporting too much surplus value, which again, I think is clearly it's a noble effort attempting to solve a problem, but emblematic of a point I'm trying to make. Now, I think underdevelopment is, I think, a uniquely sort of positioned problem, not just because it's persistent, in the sense that, well, we're still facing it, but it's persistent and actually compounding, because it's not only the case, right, that it may be the most sort of structurally lasting effect of the grossest and most grotesque parts of the formal colonial period, but it is actually, I would argue, and I do argue this in the book, the most substantial obstacle to a global climate struggle for decarbonization. If our planet is going to rapidly decarbonize, underdevelopment as a global, phenomenon is absolutely going to be a challenge to that. Yeah, Gabriel, would you click this line? Yep. Thanks. That's a list of everything I just said because I forgot to give the cue to Gabriel. So you don't actually need to read that. In any case, there's a recap because I just said a lot of things. The emphasis I want to place is on underdevelopment for sort of those kind of practical and tactical reasons, but also because I think theoretically it's sort of the moment where you realize that, you know, exploitation exclusivity, not exploitation as a critique as such, but exploitation exclusivity just reveals itself to be just theoretically inadequate to the task of a comprehensive critique, which can actually take seriously, you know, the theory of imperialism, take seriously the task of having to explain the phenomenon of imperialism as a distinctly capitalist phenomenon. Okay, so what does this ultimately amount to? Again, it amounts to basically a juxtaposition of two approaches, and the two approaches are synonymous with the two thinkers that are kind of in this debate. One, right, go back one, Gabriel, there we go, thanks. The one approach is that which you see with Brenner. Brenner's is an exploitation exclusive approach. It's an approach that says capitalism must be defined by its relations of production, and in his case, relations of production are narrowly understood as class relations. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you like. It's a little bit of terminological slippage, I think. And the other is one which I call the telos approach. And this is an approach which I've developed collaboratively with a colleague of mine who happens to be present today. That's Mr. Larry Busk. He's in the audience. So thankfully, I don't have to field those questions alone. Lucky me. This telos critique is probably also going to sound a bit familiar to you. But I hope to make the case that, unfortunately, though it's probably familiar to you, it hasn't really been analytically utilized in the ways that I think would make it most efficacious. Now, the telos critique says something that we probably all already know, which is that the ultimate aim, or telos, if you want to put it in fancy terms, of capitalist production is not human use values. It is not the flourishing of human beings. It is not their well-being. It is not our subsistence, our survival. The aim of capitalist production is infinite accumulation. It is profit. It is exchange value. And that actually, right, the most fundamental contradiction of capitalist production lies at this level. It is much more, it occurs at kind of a deeper level of abstraction. It occurs at sort of a broader, more regulative register, right? And really crucially, this isn't something that like capitalists just like choose. They're not just like, do I choose to meet people's needs or do I become a horrifically violent parasite? Au contraire, what happens is capitalist production by its nature compels all producers and appropriators to produce in this way, right? It is very much an imperative of production. Feel free to, take me to task on this during the Q&A. I would argue, I won't speak for Larry, but I would argue that this is actually the totally unique historical feature of capitalist production. Wage labor is not unique to capitalism. It is certainly unique in terms of its scale and its, just general sort of dominance as a relation of production. But wage labor was not invented by capital, right? This very distinctive approach to completely hollowing out the human production process and converting it into something non-human, something ultimately not serving human aims, but in fact serving some totally alien aim, pun entirely intended, because that was an allusion to alienation. This is in fact really something that at the broadest level contains all the sort of other contradictions which we name as capitalist contradictions. Now the really interesting thing is that up until now I've sort of presented these as like warring approaches, of like there's this silly exploitation exclusive approach and then there's this perfectly sensible, reasonable telos approach. Now I think the exploitation exclusive approach does have some very serious limitations. It has lost its GPS signal. That being said, I think that the telos approach actually doesn't, the pun also intended, exclude exploitation as a critique. On the contrary, I think the telos of production critique, what it does is it gives us a more comprehensive framework within which to be able to articulate, account for, and better comprehend why capital would choose X, Y, or Z kinds of relations in X, Y, or Z conditions, because all we have to do is index its desire to maximize profit and assess the conditions in which it is better or worse to do so using X, Y, or Z kinds of relations. It just gives us an enormous amount of historical flexibility. And we get to avoid sort of the idea that we have to be kind of, I think, really voluntaristic in our explanation. So I think it is actually a more integrated critique. Now, with regard to the actual theory of imperialism, I think we get some really, really interesting consequences. There we go, Gabriel. Quick. And these consequences are pretty multifarious. So I'm only going to sort of really quickly lay them out, and then I'm going to leave them for you to think about because there's a lot here. So first of all, speaking of integration, I think it's actually possible to draw together disparate strains within Marxist theory. So I have points here, for instance, point 1, which is extroversion, right, wherein, colonial economies are not merely dominated, sort of superficially, but rather that imperial powers sort of come in and actually hollow out the entirety of the colony's production process, and then quite literally redirect it and say, you produce something else now. This very, I think, distinct feature, which I'll go into more in a second, is something that actually, I think, is attributable more to the dependency / world systems to a lesser degree approach. Whereas I think point 2 is more attributable to someone like Ellen Meiksins Wood, who's in political Marxism. The two approaches you just saw warring a moment ago in the debate in this chapter. I actually think that in many ways the Thielist approach allows us to kind of integrate sometimes disparate strains of Marxist theory if we can sort of suspend some of their kind of basic historical assumptions. So more on this point of extroversion. So Amin kind of introduces this notion of the tributary mode of production. And a lot of people confuse this with feudalism. I'm not going to use that term because actually it's sort of geographically prejudicial in many ways. But the basic idea here is that older empires would sort of come into a region, seek military domination, and then, to put it in colloquial terms, skim off the top. They would say, hey, you got some pretty good wheat there. I'm going to go ahead and skim off that wheat. But they would not thereby redirect the entirety of production in a region. And you can use examples like the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire, certain aspects of the Ming Dynasty, etc., Imperial China. These empires, right, did not say, you are now producing entirely for export. You are now producing entirely for a global market. Why? Well, first and foremost, of course, because the global market did not quite exist. But moreover, right, the production, ultimately the direction of production still remained subsistence and still remained within the colony. Moreover, you sort of get, with the advent of capitalism and the kind of hollowing out of the imperial project, you get an increasing reliance on economic coercion. And again, this is not exclusive. It's not the case that capitalism stops relying on violence, obviously. I feel that's almost not even necessary to say, but I'll say it just in case. However, you can sort of view kind of cynically that capital, viewing from the standpoint of capital, for instance, the project of formal independence, the colonies become formally free, and what happens? Now they're driven onto the market for their subsistence. So now the imperial powers don't get their resources, raw materials, gratis, but they get them still very cheaply because they mostly still control the private entities which own mines. Ask anyone who still lives in formerly Belgian Congo, who owns many of the mines in Congo. It'll be a fairly predictable answer. And on top of that, they're now driven onto the market to have to purchase their subsistence, and it no longer comes out of the imperial coffers. Excellent cost-saving measure from the standpoint of capital. Cynical, but alas, if you're capital, excellent as far as savings go. And finally, right, there's just sort of an imminent limit that's transgressed by capitalist imperialism. When you're appropriating use values, there is a just sort of organic limitation to how much even the greediest fat cat aristocrat, that was a pun, aristocrats, right? Even the greediest aristocrat, man, that's not gonna stop. Even the greediest aristocrat, right, with the most extravagant taste, could never rival the sheer voluminous accumulation that is required by production for exchange value. There's just simply no quantitative comparison. And so by this contrast alone, capitalism is just uniquely capable of producing the condition of underdevelopment. Combine these three things and you get a rapacious and just like incalculable change in the project of imperialism that produces underdevelopment unlike any other imperial project before, right? As evidenced by the fact that we can observe in those sort of pre-modern tributary empires, certainly violence, misery, political injustice, extreme class stratification. but not the sort of sustaining underdevelopment that we still presently encounter with capitalist imperialism. My argument, essentially, is that you're only able to see these kinds of specificities if you have a 2000 critique. Thanks so much.
Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. And I'm eager also. I'm going to be discussing some of my work now, but I'm very interested and excited about Eli's book, and I think there's a lot of overlap in some of the things that we're interested in, particularly around, I think, some of these questions of dependency theory and its contributions. I'm going to be sharing some ideas that I'm developing for a monograph that I'm working on now that is preliminarily titled Culture in U.S. Empire, Fascism, Racism, and Class Struggle in Theory. And it addresses ideological struggles in the Americas around the understanding of imperialism, fascism, and racism. The first part of the book diagnoses culturalism as a very powerful ideological tendency within contemporary academic theory, produced within the U.S. specifically, but really exported all over the world. And I had you read this essay by Samir Min dealing with culturalism. Culturalism describes a tendency to treat reified cultural and ethnic features and identities as the key for explaining historical developments and social conflicts. It thereby treats cultural and ideological traits in an ahistorical manner, ignoring the specificities of the historical processes that gave rise to them. And it then imbues these traits with transhistorical permanence and universal explanatory power. So it's important to note that when Marx and Engels first developed historical and dialectical materialism in the 19th century, their theory of class struggle refuted the culturalist and racist interpretations of social conflict that were predominant within Europe at that time. And Marxists from around the world have subsequently critiqued culturalism as a cornerstone of bourgeois ideology that obscures the nature of capitalist reproduction and hides the real causes of the oppression and inequality it generates. Right? You read this in Samir Min's article that emphasizes the function of culturalism in U.S.-led imperialism. Similarly, the Mexican sociologist Pablo González Casanova has argued that culturalist interpretations of social conflicts promote an exaltation of different identities as a means of increasing the isolation and balkanization of peoples who are subject to colonialism while obscuring the operations of imperialism. Now, we see many examples of culturalism in, for example, imperialist discourses of civilizational tutelage, or in the notion of the clash of civilizations thesis, famously promulgated by State Department operative turned academic Samuel Huntington. Its argument that Islamic civilization is a leading threat to Western civilization has been used to justify U.S. imperialism in West Asia and continues to be deployed to obscure U.S. imperialism and the Zionist colonialism that it supports, as well as to misrepresent indigenous resistance to these phenomena. Now, as Amin notes in his foundational book, Eurocentrism, culturalism has been historically bound up with discourses and practices of racism. And this shouldn't surprise us, given that the categories deployed by the biological discourse of race were in fact always cultural. And historically, notions of cultural or civilizational difference, as well as biological difference, have functioned in a racializing manner by imputing innate and immutable qualities to particular groups of people and even to social classes. So for example, in Victorian ideology, class, like race, was associated with innate qualities, attitudes, values, and behaviors, which were understood as the cause of individuals' social location. This porosity between reified notions of culture and race is also very evident in contemporary underclass ideology and its notion of a, quote, a culture of poverty, right? Which functions to ideologically displace the causes of poverty from the operations of the capitalist system to supposed cultural attributes of working class people. So given that culturalism has long been identified as a key feature of colonial and imperial ideology, it shouldn't surprise us that it has a very powerful hold on the political culture of a settler colonial and imperialist state like the US.
Yet I think the degree to which this ideology shapes U.S. academic production is often overlooked. And we can see this also even in the way that knowledge production is organized. But I think very insidiously, many seemingly progressive discourses that come out of the U.S. Academy, which claim to address the condition of subaltern groups, actually rely on culturalist ideologies whose reactionary core becomes apparent when one tries to use them to understand geopolitics, history, or political strategy. I think decolonial theory is one example of one of these contemporary discourses, and so that's one I'm going to focus on. Now, the term decolonial has now become so widely used that people kind of take it for anything. It's like but it is a specifically Anglophone neologism that was emerged in association with a particular group of theorists. It emerges in the 1990s as a challenge to post-colonial theory and really specifically to Marxist-inspired anti-colonialism. And this is something, actually, Eli has a fantastic article on the weapon of theory that really lays this out and shows how this denigration and invisibilization of Marxist-inspired anti-colonialism and the tradition of national liberation Marxism is a huge part of how decolonial theorists have positioned themselves. So after it's kind of first developed at the University of Binghamton, academics who then created the Modernity, Coloniality, Decoloniality Network have positioned themselves as the spokespersons for this school of thought. And some of the most famous people include Walter Mignolo, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Ramon Grossfogel, Santiago Castro Gomez, and others. Now, one of the key precepts of the approach that decolonial theorists take is their argument that Western epistemologies are the principal cause of the social conflicts and forms of oppression that characterize what Marxists would refer to as neocolonialism, but what they often refer to as coloniality, and that therefore these Western epistemologies are also the causes of racism and even war. This is an idealist, reductivist, and non-dialectical and culturalist approach to understanding ideology, and it is one that is really fundamentally opposed to a Marxist approach to understanding human consciousness. Now, the latter is based on the understanding that human consciousness is historical and social, and that it develops as part of a complex social totality that is overdetermined by the social relations of production. It therefore, the Marxist approach proposes the analysis of the objective forces that condition humans' subjective thoughts. And this perspective stresses that the understanding that ideologies emerge from practices that operate in concrete social relations in specific contexts. And it also understands that these ideologies evolve as a constitutive element of social relations that are anchored in the mode of production. Therefore, ideologies cannot travel through time and space on their own. They're anchored in practices. And therefore, pointing to the existence of an ideology is not a sufficient explanation for a social practice. Now, by contrast, decolonial theory suggests that humans' thoughts determine historical development. And the philosophical worldview this can be described as idealism, right? And this idealism is a philosophical worldview that holds that the material world is shaped by metaphysical entities, spirits, or ideas that are detached from a material base in social relations. I think decolonial theory really exemplifies idealism insofar as it treats ideologies, or what they often refer to as epistemologies, as if these were supra-historical structures or forces that are capable of organizing social relations across time and in distinct socio-historical contexts. And this idealism underlies these theorists' claims that forms of thought underlie modern social conflicts, rather than the struggle over the means and resources that ensure life, as a Marxist theory of class struggle holds. Now, the kind of geographic reductionism that is at work in decolonial theory's sweeping dismissal of so-called Western epistemology is both anti-dialectical and ahistorical. It relies on an idealist division of human history and knowledge into Europe and its others. And these theorists positing of racism as a trans-historical structure provides a pseudo-concrete alibi for their culturalist theory of epistemology, as it attributes to their own division of knowledge along ethno-nationalist lines to racist divisions imposed by colonial processes. Now, it should be noted that despite the fact that decolonial theorists impugn Western thought in total, they themselves readily employ methods and concepts of anti-Marxist icons of the European philosophical canon, such as Michel Foucault, as well as theorists who themselves were sympathetic to colonial ideologies and practices, including Zionism in the case of Levinas and Nazism in the case of Martin Heidegger. Now, decolonial theory also really differs markedly from Marxist anti-colonialism in the kinds of solutions it proposes. Marxist analysts of imperialism and neocolonialism have argued that, like traditional colonialism, neocolonialism needs to be combated politically, economically, ideologically, and militarily. By contrast, the praxis of so-called decoloniality principally involves thinking differently, or thinking without modernity, as Mignolo puts it. So this version of a third way ideology that points beyond capitalism and socialism often rests on a vague appeal to indigenous cosmovisions. Precisely what thoughts and how these might comprise a viable strategy of decolonization is generally not specified. And this real lack of concreteness stems from the fact that what is actually being proffered under the sign of quote-unquote indigenous thought or border thinking or subaltern thought is really a kind of mythic promise of an extra ideological subject, a kind of figure of abstract alterity. And as Antonio Vázquez Arroyo has pointed out, it really is little more than the warmed over trope of the noble savage. Now, I also want to note that there's an anti-developmentalism that you find in a lot of decolonial theory that really oftentimes very inspired by postmodernist and post-structuralist discourse that critiques development per se and sees no difference between capitalist and socialist development. I think these theorists who take this position really fail to understand the life or death struggle for development that is faced by nation states that have been subject to colonial, semi-colonial, or neo-colonial domination. Because developing the productive forces is needed not only to provide for the needs of people who have been subjected to underdevelopment imposed by imperialism, but development is also necessary if those people are going to avoid being subordinated to imperialist powers in relations of economic dependency. This kind of abstract anti-developmentalism, I think, is one symptom of the populism that characterizes this type of theory. We talked about populism last Wednesday, which Lenin identified as a petty bourgeois ideology that celebrates the moral excellence of those who are oppressed and bereft of power without scientifically identifying the means to effectively struggle against this oppression. And this kind of romantic fetishization of oppressed groups that ignores the exigencies of actually struggling against imperialism, I think is also a symptom of a class position of these theorists within the imperial core and as members of a global labor aristocracy. And this is something I think that Torkel was kind of getting at in his presentation when he was talking about, having theorists who are situated in the imperial center telling people that their countries shouldn't develop and shouldn't have, because ignoring the fact that the ills of capitalist development, including the ecological crisis, have been produced by those imperialist countries precisely. Now, I think you can see one example of idealism and culturalism, and this is just one of many. You can see it in work in Nelson Maldonado Torres' account of interwar European fascism, where he argues that Nazism emerged from fundamental features of Western thought. Now, by contrast, Marxists understand fascism to be an expression of imperialist class warfare. And Marxists have argued that it has emerged from reactionary and imperialist elements of the capitalist class, and that it expresses their practical efforts to expand their rate of profit in the face of capitalist crisis, acquire territory, resources, and cheap labor, and combat the threat of socialism. And analyzing fascism as a form of class warfare has allowed Marxists to situate it within the tradition of European colonialism, and also to identify it as an outgrowth of capitalism in its imperialist phase that has manifested itself across the world,
mobilizing many different ideologies as it has done that. And so I want to now kind of turn to some examples of Marxist theorizing of both fascism and imperialism, particularly that emerged from the experience of national liberation struggles in Latin America. And I also, in this book that I'm working on, am really trying to highlight the important contributions of this body of thought, also precisely because it is constantly denigrated or invisibilized by these theorists who are always speaking in the name of the subaltern, but who are very ready to denigrate actual struggles of oppressed people against imperialism. And that includes their, like decolonial theorists, wholesale dismissal of the tradition of national liberation struggles in Latin America. And I contend that, in fact, Marxist theory, and particularly the forms that he has taken in the global south, really offers really necessary tools for understanding US-led imperialism and fascism, as well as the forms of racism and subhumanization that they promote. So it's just it's important to understand that Latin Americans' struggles in the 20th century against US-led imperialism and their efforts to pursue democratization and to pursue self-determined courses of national development were met with a vicious neo-colonial counter-revolution led by the US and by sectors of Latin America's ruling classes. In this process, the CIA worked with local compradors to overthrow leftist governments and put in their place military dictatorships friendly to the U.S. and friendly to U.S. capital and the Pentagon. With U.S. support and training, these regimes dissolved democratic institutions, suspended liberal rights, and organized death squads that extrajudicially kidnapped, tortured, and kidnapped hundreds of thousands of people. Their programs of psychological warfare promoted martial nationalism and hysterical anti-communism. And the U.S. coordinated intelligence sharing among all these Latin American regimes to facilitate their cross-border kidnappings and assassinations. The Latin American militaries also received arms and training from other colonial states, such as Israel and France. And with the imperial sponsorship of the U.S., techniques of asymmetrical warfare, terrorism, and torture that had been developed through colonial warfare against national liberation struggles in Vietnam and Algeria were imported to Latin America. Now, with this term to fascism, foreign and local capitalists aimed to not only destroy revolutionary and workers' movements, but also to roll back gains that workers had already achieved and to preempt opposition to sweeping macroeconomic counter-reforms that these regimes imposed by fiat. And these counter-reforms, which constituted the beginnings of neoliberalization, included trade liberalization, the financialization of national economies, enormous concessions for foreign capitalists, and changes to labor law that diminished workers' rights and protections. The failure of this neoliberal development model to produce a humane form of modernization has been very handily demonstrated by the subsequent explosive growth of poverty, wealth inequality, national debt, urban informality or slums, as well as deindustrialization and continued dependency on foreign credit and markets. Yet the constitutional regimes that replaced Latin America's dictatorships in the 1980s and 90s generally carried forward the same development model under the pressure of the IMF and World Bank. And these political transitions generally preserved the class structure established by the dictatorships while distancing the new state managers from these unpopular regimes. And this illustrates, I think, very well what Gramsci describes as the perfect division of labor between fascism and bourgeois democracy. That is, once ruling classes use fascism to sufficiently diminish the strength of the peasants and working classes, they can then rehabilitate democratic institutions and, quote, separate their responsibilities from those of the fascism they armed, encouraged, and incited to struggle against the workers. Now, in the 1960s and 70s, in the context of sharpened struggle against U.S. imperialism, which was turning to fascism by proxy as a preferred form of political management, Marxists in Latin America were developing key insights of dependency theory. Some of its leading thinkers included the Brazilians Rui Mauro Marini, who Eli mentioned, Teotonio dos Santos, and Vania Bambira, and the German-American Andre Gunder Frank. They critiqued the form of capitalist modernization that U.S. imperialism
and its comprador allies were seeking to impose upon Latin American countries with the false promise that this would allow them to catch up with developed nations. So countering the precepts of liberal modernization theory, these Marxist dependency theorists argued that the actual outcome of capitalist modernization in Latin America was the superexploitation of Latin American workers, the concomitant degradation of their lives, as well as the strengthening of Latin Americans' dependency upon imperial capital. While liberal modernization theory promoted industrialization as a solution for everything, the dependency theorists identified the specific operations of dependent capitalism in Latin America and demonstrated why Latin American countries' position within the global capitalist economy meant that even with industrial development, they would continue to suffer underdevelopment and economic dependency on foreign capital. Now, Marini identified this structural disjuncture between production and consumption that exists in dependent capitalist countries as one source of the superexploitation its workers suffer. And this is also, going back to what Eli was talking as well about, Samira Min's writing on this is also very key. But essentially, Marini argues that to become competitive in global markets, Latin American capitalists relied on extremely cheap labor to supply foreign markets with commodities. And because their workers were largely irrelevant as consumers in the realization of surplus value, capitalists tended to exploit them as much as possible through the intensification of their work, the extension of the working day, and the payment of very low wages, which essentially amounts to the expropriation of workers' consumption fund. And because this superexploitation essentially denies these workers the conditions needed to replenish their labor, it leads to the quote, premature exhaustion of workers from whom capital appropriates future years of life. And this, I think, is a really key thing to understand about this analysis. It's that it's something that, if you, Ali Qadri's really excellent book on the accumulation of waste, I think addresses this as this fundamental dynamic of the way imperialist capitalism operates, which essentially, if you're thinking about the fact that there is a significant stratum of the working class within imperial metropoles that enjoys a much higher quality of life because of these imperialist super profits that their own national bourgeoisies are able to garner, that essentially, as Qadri puts it, you have a situation of northern classes cannibalizing the southern classes, because it's this idea that people are literally paying with their shortened lives, right? And this is, the concept of social murder is really key to this analysis. So Marini, Frank, and Dos Santos all argued that because dependent capitalism could only offer Latin American proletarians poverty wages and restricted consumption, it would require their intensified repression and exclusion from politics. So for this reason, they said Latin America was at a crossroads facing the choice between socialism and fascism. Now, Marxist dependency theory is grounded in the methods and insights of Marx, Engels, and Lenin, and it was also very much influenced by Marxist revolutionaries from Latin America. This, of course, included the leaders of the Cuban Revolution. Its importance on these intellectual developments can't be overstated. It also includes communists from earlier generations, such as José Carlos Mariátegui, who was a Peruvian communist militant who identified in Peru's dependent capitalism the basis for its underdevelopment and the basis of the racist oppression of its indigenous majority. So in the early 60s, Marini, Dos Santos, and Frank were all at the University of Brasilia, and there they were influenced by the POLOP, which is the Revolutionary Marxist Organization Política Operaria, and which itself was very critical of the Moscow-oriented Brazilian Communist Party notion of a progressive national bourgeoisie. Though this position that was taken by the POLOP was considered ultra-leftist by some, I think the suspicion of the national bourgeoisie was given credence by many when in 1964 a sector of Brazil's bourgeoisie allied with the CIA to overthrow the reformist Goulart government and pursue capitalist modernization under fascist military dictatorship. So as this regime was torturing and disappearing thousands of leftists, the dependency theorists were among the many people who fled the country, and they fled to Chile. And there, many were influenced by, and in some cases militated in, Marxist cadre organizations, such as the MIR, or the Movimiento de la Izquierda Revolucionaria, in which Marini was a member. Like the POLOP, the MIR was suspicious of the notion of a progressive national bourgeoisie and urged Salvador Allende's government to go farther in expropriating Chile's national bourgeoisie. Now, other Latin American revolutionaries who were contemporaries of the dependency theorists also identified ways that U.S. imperialism in the region intensified the special oppressions experienced by persons subject to internal colonialism, racialization, and gender oppression. For instance, in the 1970s, the Bolivian organizer and organic intellectual Domitila Barrios de Chungara argued that women's domestic slavery in Bolivia was intensified by U.S. imperialism, as the superexploitation of wage workers was only possible because of all of the unpaid reproductive labor of wives and mothers, who were nonetheless treated as disposable. Unlike the Brazilian dependency theorist Vânia Bambira, Barrios de Chungara participated in international feminist debates, arguing that the liberation of working women could only be achieved by working alongside male workers to overthrow capitalism. In 1954, at the behest of U.S. capitalists, the CIA overthrew Guatemala's reformist government and set up a comprador military regime. The protracted national liberation struggle that this catalyzed was met with genocidal violence, including scorched earth destruction of scores of indigenous peasant villages. The Fuerzas Armadas Rebeldes, or rebel armed forces, was one of the Marxist guerrillas formed in the country in the 1960s. And they argued that the counterinsurgent violence that U.S. imperialism was promoting across Latin America took a distinctly colonial character for indigenous Guatemalans. Identifying the links between imperialism and colonialism, as well as U.S. capital's tendency to govern by proxy, allowed these revolutionaries to trace similarities between the genocide and dispossession suffered by indigenous Guatemalans and the conditions faced by Palestinians under U.S.-backed Zionist settler colonialism. Now, in 1973, a CIA-backed coup installed a military dictatorship in Chile that made it into a laboratory for neoliberal economic doctrine and barbaric state terrorism. So the dependency theorists were again made into political exiles among hundreds of thousands who fled Chile. And Marini argued that the coup against Salvador Allende's democratic socialist government expressed the class warfare of a layer of the national and foreign bourgeoisies directed against another sector of Chile's ruling class, its petty bourgeoisie and massive workers. He said that it exemplified a form of military fascism that was being used across Latin America as an effective means to impose the development model desired by foreign and national capital. And this form of fascism relied on a specific sector of the middle class, the military, who formed part of a counter-insurrectionary strategy the U.S. had imposed on Latin America, across Latin America since the Cuban Revolution. So the Marxist dependency theorists understood that fascism was used to exclude the working classes from political participation as their economic oppression was being increased. Álvaro Briones also argued that fascism was needed to liquidate any opposition from the national bourgeoisie that had been displaced from power, as well as from the petty bourgeoisie, which tended to become radicalized in these kind of conditions. Marini identified financial speculation as a powerful weapon wielded by fascist forces in their struggle for power. In Chile, capitalist diversion of capital from production to financial speculation successfully undermined the economic system while increasing their own economic power. And by squeezing everyday consumers, it increasingly positioned them as competitors and fomented suspicion of the working classes among the middle layers. Now, dependency theorists also noted important differences between the Latin American dictatorships and European fascism. For example, the former were not expansionist, and rather than constituting an authentically nationalist orientation, they were characterized by the total submission to foreign capital. While this is true, these regimes can also be seen in the context of a neo-colonial configuration of fascism, wherein U.S. imperialism, operating by proxy, did indeed expand its economic and political power.
Andre Gunter Frank argued that because the Latin American regimes did not have a significant base among their domestic petty bourgeoisie and instead relied on the military and foreign support to rule, they should be considered authoritarian rather than fascist. Yet we should also not discount these regimes' ambitious cultural warfare and psychological operations, or the support that they did enjoy from important sectors of civil society, including the Catholic Church, bourgeois media, technocrats, and some aspects of the bourgeois and petty bourgeois sectors. And I think the fact that they established real roots in civil society is evidenced by the fact that apologists for and former functionaries of these dictatorships had been elected to the highest offices of government since the return of democracy. So rather than assign new names to what cannot help but be discrete phenomenon, I instead follow Samir Amin's suggestion that we recognize both the unity and diversity of fascism. And this allows us to recognize it as a form of anti-democratic political management that has taken distinct forms as it has been used by capitalist classes around the world to manage crises of accumulation and crises of hegemony, to expand the rate of profit, to undertake forms of so-called primitive accumulation, and to crush anti-systemic forces. And while fascism regularly mobilizes nationalist, chauvinist, racist, patriarchal, xenophobic, religious supremacist, and anti-communist ideologies to secure support among middle layers, because these ideologies are pragmatic, they necessarily vary in different historical contexts. Also, lest we fall into the Eurocentric trap of exceptionalizing European fascism, we do well to remember that it itself was an iteration of the colonial tradition that had long been pursued by Europeans and US Americans. Indeed, Hitler openly expressed his admiration for British colonialism in India and saw in the US's settler colonial states' westward conquest of Native Americans' territory a model for the conquest he planned on the East in pursuit of Lebensraum, or living space. Hitler also admired the codification of racial hierarchies and second-class citizenship within US law, especially the subordination of African American workers within the Jim Crow apartheid regime, as well as the US's race-based immigration laws. And as Domenico Losordo's wonderful book, The Counter-History of Liberalism, demonstrates, the precedents for fascism had long been part of the fabric of Western liberalism. This is seen not only in Western elites' colonial practices, but also in the fascist terror they have exercised domestically against racialized and insurgent workers, as well as in the Herrenvolk democracy, or democracy only for a chosen people, that they have historically promoted. And finally, I just want to note, that the work that Justin Akers-Chacon has been doing recently in providing a Marxist historicization of U.S. fascism. And he argues that its specific features inhere in the duly intertwined projects of settler colonial capitalism and empire building. So he suggests that forms of violence that characterized U.S. settler colonialism have been reconfigured and redeployed in defining episodes of U.S. capitalism and state building, including slavery, territorial conquest, and the state's repression of organized resistance from the working class. Likewise, the U.S.'s history of deploying its military around the world to gain control of markets, topple governments, and crush left-wing labor and popular movements has imbued U.S. imperialism with fascist characteristics. And so the rise of fascism within the U.S. can be understood in part as something akin to the colonial boomerang Aimé Césaire identified in European fascism. That is, with shifts in global class struggle and the decline of U.S. empire, fascist practices that U.S. elites have long deployed abroad and by proxy are increasingly returning home. And as Chacon notes, these are seen especially in the domestic policing of racialized and foreign workers who themselves are coming from states that have been colonized, semi-colonized, or otherwise subordinated to U.S. empire. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you guys so much. So we'll open it up for questions and take a round first from people in the room.
Yeah, thanks for both of these talks. They were both amazing. I just wanted to ask Jennifer, and then I guess also Eli, if you have any takes on this as well, about culturalism more specifically and the way it's been kind of deployed within the humanities, which I see as like a big, I guess, kind of like issue, sort of area of academia vis-a-vis culturalism. But what do you make of the certain ways that race has been theorized in the terms of racial form as opposed to racial formation? Working with like Raymond Williams' idea of cultural Marxism, where he kind of argues that the superstructure and the base have been in a certain way idealized by contemporary Marxists, and the ways that that paradigm was originally theorized by Marx were much more permeable and much more co-constitutive. And yeah, the ways that like racial form maybe is a more productive way of thinking about race that doesn't rely so much on the sort of culturalist arguments you're talking about, or is there any way to think about race beyond the merely ideological or superstructural or whatnot?
Thank you very much. That was very fantastic. I think my question is mostly towards Eli.
Could you talk a little louder, please?
Okay, yeah, sorry. So, I just wanted to ask about like the implications of decentralizing the critique of capitalism from workers to the more decolonial and decarbonization, and what this means for the universality that underpins traditional Marxist thought. Because I think once you talk about colonialism, this idea of the global proletariat with material interests and a shared historical destiny becomes a bit destabilized because, well, in the case of workers, we're talking about, exploitation of labor, whereas in colonization, you're talking about slavery and literal looting of wealth. So, so they're exploited in different degrees. So, factoring these in, can we, what does that mean for the idea of a collective revolutionary agency? And can we speak of a universal revolutionary class? Because when you talk about things like race, it seems that boiling it all down to class seems a bit difficult to do. And I think this is what Fanon brings out in his critiques of Marxism, that, you have to talk about race, not just class. So, yeah, I just wanted to ask.
Thank you both for your super well put together presentations. And I just wanted to ask you to maybe make it more explicit, the reasons that you've put these two presentations next to each other. Well, I think I can get it. I've been thinking about it while you've been talking, but I was wondering maybe if you could put it in a few sentences, how maybe using a theory of telos of production can help us think through maybe these culturalist arguments when we're analyzing post-colonial, neo-colonial, whatever, situations to get to a more grounded materialist analysis.
I guess this is more for Jennifer. Thank you for that. I guess one thing I'm wondering is, do you think it's fair to lump the first generation of subaltern studies into this culturalist critique? Because, well, I have certain issues with Guha in particular, and also the kind of superficial reading of Gramsci. At the same time, they are responding to a sort of material failure of the Indian developmental state, and are coming kind of out of a explicitly Marxist discourse. Certainly degenerates later, but.
Okay, no, just to express a wish to Jennifer. We are, It would be fantastic if you could give me some advice of good books against decolonialization from a Marxist point of view. And maybe if we, because in France it's pretty new, of course it is grounded in the academy also, but not really in the society. But I think we have to defend ourselves against this kind of theories. I'd like the way you're using Samir Amin and Domenico Sordo. Samir Amin, I didn't know the article you meant, because at the end of his life he was not really talking about. I knew him just before he died because he was living in Paris, but this kind of work I didn't know. And maybe we could publish some article of yours. It would be fantastic if we could sum up what can be done from a publication point of view. Yes, thank you.
Thank you for these really interesting talks. I was hoping you could say more, mostly Eli, but also Jennifer, about the role of consumption as a key feature of capitalist imperialism, particularly the expansion of markets for consumption, major feature of 19th century British imperialism, and how this relates both to crises of production and the replacement of subsistence production with extraversion, particularly if one of the key features of fascism in the Latin American context is the expropriation of the consumption fund from workers, how that works within the simultaneous subordination of the periphery to capitalist markets as sites for consumption. So yeah, thanks so much.
Is that? Oh, okay.
I think the first one was for you.
Okay.
Oh wait.
Oh, sorry, one more question. Okay.
Can I just sorry, there was space, so I thought I'd jump in. I know you have like a million questions. Just around, I feel so resonant with the critique of culturalism, and then I also get that a huge part of even what Marx describes is like how much we've lost, right? Like capital destroys the patriarchal and suspicious, all that stuff, but like we've lost something in that. And there's so much energy in reclaiming as an organizing principle that has to do with culture and gets formulated in that way. And so just this question of like definitely in Latin America with the Nueva Canción and stuff, like the way that culture can also be used as a weapon, but the complexity of that. So any more thoughts on that?
Well, maybe I'll speak to that first, because I want to be clear that I'm not saying that culture is not important or that we don't need an analysis of culture. And I think you're absolutely right to say it's considering culture and ideology is absolutely essential in any kind of actual strategy, because people experience their experience of reality is mediated through culture and through ideology. So understanding that terrain and struggling on that terrain is essential. I think the matter, though, is how we think about culture. And what I'm arguing against is this essentially an ahistorical approach to culture that can, pick aspects of it out and treat them as if they stood outside of history, and that they themselves are not open to interrogation as to where did they come from? How did these aspects of culture develop? I mean, one of the things we know about humans is the incredible dynamism and changeability of our culture and consciousness. So we do need to provide explanations as to where these ideas come from, or these forms of consciousness. And that actually, I think, is really essential when you're thinking about something like organizing, because that means also that these ideas can be, if they're historicized, we also understand how they have changed and how they can be changed. Rather than, if you treat a certain form of consciousness as just sitting above history, like you get in certain kinds of schools of thought that treat racism as, racial ideologies as almost a metaphysical force that itself has organized all of, history across time. You don't have any account of where it came from or how it could possibly be changed. So that I hope I can, I'm differentiating like why these matter. And I actually all of my work is on culture. So I think I'm in no way dismissing it, but it is what I am arguing for is a historically grounded approach to culture, which also includes the knowledge that we produce as intellectuals, which would demand, an analysis of the institutions that are promoting this kind of knowledge, where they're situated within global class relations, how that also has an effect on the kind of knowledge that is produced or isn't circulated. So it's actually, I think, what I'm arguing for, just a more robust approach to thinking about culture, not at all to dismissing it. I think the question that you asked, Vinay, sort of about the role of culture in the humanities, I think is a huge one. It is really, like, I'd say it's actually hegemonic within the U.S. humanities. And that goes for all different kinds of, fields. I think that, I think I mentioned Adolph Reed Jr.'s work before, and I think he provides really excellent explanations as to why this is the case, particularly in his book Class Notes, which was published in the early 2000s. And he, in it, talks about the kind of detachment that U.S. intellectuals, professional intellectuals have from, like, an increasing detachment from actual working class movements or organizing that you really see, particularly from the 70s onward, that has fostered a kind of academic discourse that is completely detached from practical questions of social transformation and organizing, and very detached from speaking to working class people as well, and that itself fosters a kind of theorizing that is not accountable, and not accountable also often to the constituencies in whose name it's often speaking. And I think that's also, that aspect, that sort of representational aspect, is also important to his critique, because he also argues that there's a kind of the forms of racial liberalism instituted in the U.S. in the wake of the struggles for civil rights, organize the way that there is a stratum of the PMC, or the professional managerial class, that is incentivized to speak in the name of generally racialized constituencies to secure its own position of authority, and providing this kind of mediating role between the ruling class and those sectors of the working class in whose name they are speaking, right? And who they are often representing, but again, oftentimes without any kind of actual accountability. So he argues that this produces this sort of structure where you are, to be an X, you speak in the name of the X's, and that is actually a path to consolidate one's authority and oftentimes one's career. And for that reason, he really identifies what I'm calling this kind of culturalist tendency. I think what he would oftentimes refers to as a kind of race reductionism, as a specifically petty bourgeois ideology, right? That is one that takes on this form, and I think a particularly pervasive form within the U.S. because of the sort of ways that this representational structures and the place of the PMC within it correspond to the kind of structures of U.S. racial liberalism, where political constituencies are imagined and often given resources as racialized groups. So I think that's an important part of an explanation for it. And also, frankly, I think like this, analysis of understanding culturalism's place within imperialism and its constant utility for U.S. imperialism really, is like the fact that we see it in like the warmongering discourse that the bourgeois media promotes. We see it in it's really apparent in the explanations that are given for for U.S. wars is constantly being given in culturalist terms. So I think that the fact that also affects our institutions of knowledge production, even though like as a kind of organizing ideology, I think shouldn't surprise us. In terms of,
I'm just wondering, because I agree with all of your critiques and I find them very compelling, but I'm also trying to think about what sort of scholarship then is kind of not beholden to the ills of culturalism. And I know like in a lot of Asian Americanist critique, like there is a very like strong and rigorous commitment to thinking about Asian American subjectivity, for example, through class. And that's why I brought up the concept of racial form, which is specifically Asian Americanist, like has Asian Americanist origins. And I don't think this is like some form of like coercive nomadicism where like Asian Americanists are trying to speak for Asian Americans on a representational basis, because there's so many critiques of representationality and critiques of liberal multiculturalism, specifically within Asian Americanist work. And so I'm just wondering if like you could comment a little bit more directly and explicitly on racial form as an idea, which tries to displace the representational issues and lacks of ideas such as a racial formation, like Omi and Wanat theorize.
Yeah. I can't speak really at length about the issue of racial form because that's not actually something that I've worked on. So I can't speak to that. I think that the question that you raised about kind of the permeability, as you kind of announced it, you described it as trying to deal or take seriously the dialectical interrelationship of base and superstructure, which of course like Marx and Engels themselves really insisted on. That makes perfect sense to me. Though I would say that I think there are, for one, I would just say there are a lot of academic discourses that, you know, take seriously this critique of representation, but are still essentially playing that representational. That is their function. Whether you know, there's frankly a lot of academic discourses that say that they are anti-essentialist, and they're extremely essentialist. I mean, that is very true of, I think plenty of these people who I'm talking about would say that they're completely anti-essentialist. So I think, and also, you know, the position of being in that role of representation is not something that one can just choose to not be in. I mean, it is part of the structures within which we work, and it's part of what I'm trying to say. Like I'm in Latino studies, and I can say, like, I'm not going to play any role of, you know, having any claim towards representing Latino people, but my institutional position and you know, is still structurally presumes that and will circulate my work in that way, for example. But I also want to say, because there are also a lot of ways of saying, of kind of gesturing towards the interpenetration of base and superstructure that you know, if we do that in a rigorous way, but there's a lot of you know, attempts at that actually really muddy the difference between the economic base and ideology, and don't think about the kind of difference between what an ideology is as, you know, something that itself has to be explained in relationship to material practices and to an, you know, actual class relations, social position. So, you know, I can't, like I said, I think that those, and I kind of, you know, I said this in, I think the first week that we talked about, you know, you can't explain, if you say that you're going to explain things by referring to like racism and ideology as a, you know, which is race as an ideology, which we know is an ideology, we know race is not a real thing, you have to then account for the history of that ideology, and that account is going to have to take you back to talking about concrete material practices. So they cannot provide the same kind, it's not the same kind of thing, it can't provide the same kind of explanation. I'll say a few more and then I'm going to turn it over to you. I wanted to say about this, the question of why are these two panels together, I wanted to speak, that was maybe more because I wanted to speak alongside Eli because I have such great admiration for their work, and I'm also really, I think that this, the kind of work that you're doing and really talking about the importance of the Marxist analyses of imperialism is like the antidote to a lot of the culturalist stuff that I think is really misleading and that tries to, talk vaguely about coloniality, but doesn't have actually any good tools for doing this. And I think the tradition that Eli is talking about, in fact, is where it's at. If you want to look, for these examples to explain underdevelopment, to explain so-called coloniality. And also, as I mentioned, Eli wrote a fantastic critique of decolonial theory several years ago. So in terms of some of what your question, Emmerich, about there's actually been a lot of great things published on this. Eli's article is one. Antonio Vasquez Arroyo has published on this. Neil Larson. There's Kevin Oching Okoth. His book Red Africa has a great critique. Neil Lazarus has a great critique called The Jargon of Decoloniality. And I can, what I'll do is I've put these on the shared Google Doc that we have, and I'll make sure that you have it, because I think that we have
We can make a list.
Yeah, we'll make a list, and it
list.
should be. I think it is something that should be put forward. And then just briefly, I wanted to say about subaltern studies. I'm glad you asked that question, because there's a way that the decolonial theorists have really tried to separate themselves from post-colonial and theory and subaltern studies. But I actually think there's a lot of similarities, and particularly, like I'm thinking of Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe, where he basically says, like, we don't need Marx, actually we need Heidegger. Just thinking like that kind of anti-Marxist Heideggerianism that you see there. You see a lot of the decolonials pick up on that. The kind of Foucauldian approach that you see in somebody like Partha Chatterjee. You also see a lot in decolonial theory, and I'm not the first person to say this, like Linda Martinalkov has talked about Mignolo as being a Foucauldian. So, and they're both really, and particularly when you're talking about like people like Chakrabarty and Chatterjee, they're similarly, like the decolonials, I think very much influenced by French theory, by postmodernist thought, and very critical of the tradition of Marxist anti-colonialism. They generally to be anti-statist. They don't make differentiations between socialist and capitalist development. And they also, I think, a lot of subaltern studies really suffers from this kind of romantic populism that I've talked about, that it is invested in the subaltern as long as they're not struggling to take state power. And that when they do, that is, outside of the purview of their interests. So I actually probably see a lot of continuities there, and I'd be curious what you think about that. I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer. To the race question, I did have some reading I could recommend if you wanted some. Yeah. Julius Nyerere has an essay that's not very widely read. It's called "Socialism is Not a Racialism," which is a fascinating essay about including white settlers in the anti-colonial movement, which is a really it's sort of like a sort of surprising strategic. It turns out race isn't the basis of how we choose membership in political movements. Politics is. I know it's a shocking and appalling claim. That was a joke. It's not a shocking or appalling claim. Amilcar Cabral also has numerous, really, like all of Cabral's essays in Unity and Struggle, like repeatedly refer to the fact that like racial membership is not a classification of like political membership. And all these occur in anti-colonial contexts, but it is an interesting, I think, litmus for, at least again in the context of like national liberation struggle, instances where you would think actually like racial membership is like sort of being in some ways galvanized and taken very, very seriously is actually precisely those moments being destabilized as a moment of like saying actually racialism is actually being installed by the colonizer. We should not reinforce it any further, and as a matter of fact we should take this opportunity of not only ousting the colonial yoke but dismantling it as quickly politically as possible. So it just maybe some things that are worth considering in terms of thinking about how it occurs outside of, I know it's not directly related, but it could just be, some interesting inspo, just a thought. Plus, I love to plug those essays because no one ever reads them. No one ever reads like when anti-colonial people are like, don't do things on the basis of racial membership, aka don't be a nativist, which is like good advice for everybody. Don't be a nativist. Anyway. Okay, so your question is super complicated, as I'm sure you well know. It's a very, very complex question. So I'm going to do my best. The first thing I'm going to do is do a rare thing and answer like a philosopher. I rarely ever answer like a philosopher anymore because I work so much in political economy now, but I am in fact a philosopher by training. So let me first, lay down some obvious philosophical commitments I have, which is I am a universalist, I am a humanist, and I am a rationalist. And these are my foremost three commitments, and they cannot be transgressed by any other commitments I have. So I am very concerned with the universality of Marxism as it happens. So this is why it's a very good question, but also very complicated. One thing I think I want to make sure I'm not sort of misleading anyone, which is I have absolutely no interest in replacing the category of class with the category of nation. This is of no interest to me whatsoever. There are certainly people who I think under what I believe is the mistaken notion that this is a good idea. I do not think this is a good idea. I think these are just registers of analysis. Sometimes when you're analyzing certain kinds of relations, it makes sense to focus on the relations between states, and other times it makes more sense to focus on the relations of class within states, given that one process is being executed by a state at a sort of macro level. But ultimately, we're always really talking about class relations, which are simply, sort of represented at a state level. That's ultimately what we're talking about. So I don't want to lose sight of that. So for instance, if I said, right, I don't know, the United States is currently backing, the genocidal apartheid state of Israel, if I hypothetically said that, I'm clearly not saying the entire working class of the United States is endorsing this. That would be a ridiculous claim, would it not? It certainly would. I'm sure there are people who do. I live in the state of Florida in the United States, so I'm well aware that they are. But alas, not everyone. So, I'm well aware that states often, when I'm sort of talking about states, I'm also talking about class actions. I don't want to lose sight of that. That being said, it is the case, right, that geopolitics functions. We live in a world that sort of, we could give the usual spiel of post-Westphalia and all this business, wherein, right, states are sovereign, and so we have to, treat them in the way the UN treats them, with little lines around them, and little lines mean things because they distribute resources in legal jurisdiction, which is not unimportant. So that being said, I want to be really clear that my intervention is at the analytic and causal explanation level. So I think what oftentimes is maybe sometimes a bit surprising is that the outcome of this, in terms of tactical action, doesn't actually change all that drastically in terms of okay, well, where is the sort of strategic pressure being applied? It's still class struggle. I think the best way to transform the tools of production is still class struggle. That actually hasn't changed at all. Who is the best agent for that? Yeah, the global working class, which has a universal interest in transforming the conditions under which it is deprived of the use values owed to it as human beings who are being deprived of their flourishing under a system which is inhuman. I still think that's fundamentally true. Therefore, Marxism's universality has not diminished in the least, in my opinion. Perhaps someone disagrees with me, that's fine. What I will say is that the goal, ultimately, of that class struggle has broadened, right? I think there are many people who are convinced that, come Tuesday, right, revolution comes, the eradication of exploitation means capitalism is over. I am not convinced of that. There are market socialists, for instance. This is a foil we talk about in this collaborative essay that Larry and I wrote. There are market socialists like Richard Wolff and David Schweikert, and really plenty of folks in the DSA, right, the Democratic Socialists of America, who again, sort of are more market friendly, who will say, well, the existence of competitive markets is not as such a problem. Which, anybody with a serious ecological consciousness is immediately sweating very profusely right now, right? This is something we should worry about. But they'll say, right, all we have to do is workers will take ownership of the means of production, the job is done. We can all go home, kick back, have a beer, and everybody's good. I would say that the goal has to be something a little bit more substantive than that. We have to have a more determinate sense of what will happen once class struggle is sort of successful, assuming, of course, that it is. So, I mean, the obvious thing here is I shouldn't bury the lead. The upshot chapter of the book does defend rational planning. So in that sense, I'm politically distinct from a lot of folks who are writing in this regard. And in this sense, actually, I'm totally ununique, totally unspecial, because actually I think one of the politically distinctive things about many anti-colonial Marxists, many anti-imperialist Marxists, is that because they're writing during the period of the Cold War, and because they were, therefore it's prior to the end of when this became completely unfashionable, rational planning was not a foul word. You could still say it very loudly. State ownership of the means of production, centralized, collective organization of the basic means of life, and so on. So that is the upshot of this book, for what it's worth. In case you were sort of like, what is lurking politically underneath this analytical assertion that this person is making? It's not lurking. There it is. So hopefully that at least begins to answer your question. Yeah. I could say like so much more, but I feel like if I open the can any further, it sort of won't stop flowing. So my hope is that I've at least begun. Okay. Thanks a bunch for your question. Yeah, why are we together? I thought it was because we were anti-imperialist. I just assumed that we're the anti-imperialist alliance and they just shoved us onto one panel or something. I don't know. No, I mean, likewise, yeah, I really appreciate the intervention Jennifer is making. It's an intervention that I feel like if I could shout it from the rooftops of like every conference I ever went to, I would. I find the culturalist tendency like immensely frustrating and enormously distracting, given that like the actual political problems have not lessened like even a little bit. Again, like I find myself infinitely concerned with the material reality of severe and like increasing underdevelopment as we're about to be slammed with an existential ecological crisis, and somehow someone is trying to tell me that the notion of reason is European, and I don't know what to do with that. I feel honestly like incapacitated when I'm confronted with a notion so patently absurd, frankly. So I mean, maybe that's why we're together, because both of us are like just really intolerant of someone who just like clearly has no perception of what the political exigencies are, like read the room. And by the room, I mean the atmosphere of our planet. Anyway, there was another question about consumption. I think I wanted to get a better sense of your question, because I think I kind of generally know what you're asking me, but I want to be sure before I answer. So your question was sort of like asking me to connect to because I did actually, some sparks were going on when Jennifer was sort of talking about, Marini's assertion about sort of how Latin American workers are kind of, essentially they're estimated to be kind of minimal consumers. They don't sort of consume quite as much, that's true. That's just, Marini's not incorrect about that. In fact, there's much in Marini that's just correct. And so you're sort of wondering how does sort of consumption play vis-a-vis, market expansion in relation to the telos of production? Is there something that's talk to me more about what's motivating the question so I can get a better sense of like what exactly you want from me, if that makes sense. Yeah, okay.
Reading the chapter, I kept thinking with the telos of production, we're thinking about the goal of exchange value. Use value to exchange value is about consumption. And partly,
I'm not sure that's entirely true, but go on. I want to hear more about this.
And that the accounts of capitalist imperialism that you get in 19th century Marxism, both in Marxist writings on the Opium War, on deindustrialization of India, it's largely focused on the use of colonized subjects as a market, particularly in cases of production. And I was curious how that relates to the telos of the telos account, and how consumption functions, especially when there's the contradictory function here of consumption, where colonized workers are both hyper-exploited and have no resources for consumption, and consume so much less than, of course, the labor aristocracy, but simultaneously are positioned within a full market system where they're forced to consume, particularly in the disruption of subsistence agriculture, the replacement by cash crops, the very removal of the means of life in exchange for wage labor.
Okay, I think I have a clearer sense now. Interestingly, it's rare that I want to give like all that much credo to Robert Brenner, because some of the historical points he makes are infuriating. They are. Like, he'll just be like, well, capitalism is essentially wage labor. I know there's slavery, never mind slavery. I'm like, whoa, what do you mean, never mind slavery? Clearly, there's a lot of capital that's drawn from slavery. You can't just say ignore slavery. What do you mean? And he does that a lot, and it's immensely politically and analytically frustrating. But there's a lot about Brenner this is what's, tough about it. It's a lot that's true, which is like even more frustrating. And I think there's one point sort of in here that makes this analysis interesting, which is actually like, he gives this account of like, well, the rise of capitalism, is essentially about the enclosures, the expropriation of the commons. Again, that is the rise of capitalism in England. I have no basic controversy about, like, fine. I don't care to take him to task about that at this present moment. If someone wants to have a really long conversation about the earlier Dobbs-Sweezy debate later, I'm happy to talk about you. I'm not going to subject everyone to that. But interestingly, it sounds like sort of the same in the case of like, right, if you have sort of the expectation, right, that you're not going to be able to extract, right, profit from someone in a consumption capacity, you're still going to be able to, extract it if they're forced for their subsistence onto the market. In other words, right, like extroversion toward the market, just sort of at sort of the nation state level has already achieved what might be achieved, right, through hyper-exploitation. It's just sort of 6 of one, half dozen of another, right? So like, for instance, I think there are a lot of analyses that might expect, actually there are people, I think someone like Brenner would expect this to happen. I think if you followed Brenner's logic, he would say like, well, that's why eventually Latin American workers are just going to get paid more, so that there will be more consumption, because when there's more, the forces of production will just continue to develop, and then we'll just get human development, because he thinks force of production and human development are just synonymous, and I'm like, they are not. Again, there are just numerous examples of like high technological development and low human quality of life density. This is, all over the world. But yeah, so I think, really it's just a question of like, yeah, you get, profits can be derived from more than one source, whether they're being derived from, right, the fact that I'm able to extract more surplus value, because I'm sort of hyper exploiting you, right, super exploiting you in the case of Latin American workers, or because even if you're not sort of luxury consuming, right, I'm still able to derive greater profits because I've already your post-independence economy has already been transitioned to market subsistence. You have an imperative, you have to buy, right? Which, by the way, is precisely why Latin American states attempted import substitution, and import substitution was a disaster, right? It just like tanked their economies, because it turns out when you take an entirely extroverted economy and attempt import substitution as a solution for that extroversion, it turns out that's an extremely superficial solution to that basic problem. Does this sort of attempt to answer your question? I'm still not 100% sure that I understand, but I think that's the best that I can do given my understanding.
We'll just talk about it later.
Okay, all right. If you feel like you some wheels turn and you get a clearer sense or another question, just ask me. Yeah. All right.
Do you want to do a follow-up? Yeah. We just have somebody online too, but go ahead. Is it a quick? Yeah, do it. Just
okay.
Turn the mic on.
Like so?
Hold it down. Hold down the button until it goes red. And let go. Use this one. Yeah. It's probably good enough as long as you...
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Larry. I'm a co-author of Eli's. Just a really quick follow-up to this exchange about consumption. I think maybe what this question is getting at is this contradiction that is built into capitalism between the fact that it wants to pay people as low as possible, but it also wants people to consume as much as possible. And one way that it solved that problem is through the expansion of the credit, which since the 1970s has just exploded, which obviously has the function of artificially stimulating aggregate demand, but also as a means of originary or quote-unquote primitive accumulation. Because obviously, if you can't pay your creditors, they take your shit. So, yeah, just to add on a little more to this exchange.
Wonderful. I see we have one question online. I'm just going to add one on quickly, and then I'll turn the floor over to João. Eli, well, both of the presentations I really appreciated. I was curious, how does the telos of production relate to property and power? Particularly because many people will define capitalism in terms of ownership and in particular of the means of production. So I'm just curious how those two relate. And an addendum to that is, how would you respond to the critique, and it's not one that I have, but it's one that I would anticipate, of reductionism, where you take capitalism, some people reduce it to exploitation. How would you respond to people who would say, oh, well, you're including exploitation, but ultimately you're giving us a reductivist account because you're relating it to the telos? And then for Jennifer, I was curious, it seems that one of your points of insistence is that you want us to be able to see through the superstructural manifestations of fascism to get at the socioeconomic forces that are ultimately driving them. And so I wanted to hear more on how it is that you can render visible the Latin American politics driven by the U.S. empire as being fascist. You use the term, for instance, neo-colonial version of fascism, fascism by proxy. It's this kind of undercover version of fascism. Why exactly does it take that form, given the well-known literature on kind of fascism in Germany or fascism in Italy, where you have, the petty bourgeoisie that's mobilized by big capital in a project of industrial redevelopment for colonial wars? how would you take that general set of parameters and then relate it to what's going on in Latin America, which is quite a different context? Joao, you want to share your question with us?
Sure, thank you very much. I really like both presentations, and I think likewise the economic imperative must be always emphasized, and in this regard one could really well connect, I think, Wood's work on imperialism with Lenin's understanding of political annexation as colonialism and economic annexation as neocolonialism. But I have actually another question, because as Gabriel, with the text and also by speaking another occasion, share with us his trajectory as sort of self-critique, and I think this is really important, especially for the left, the Marxist left. I was really curious to understand the trajectory of you two, to understand if you also, in a former time, were producing knowledge for exchange value, and in this way unwillingly supporting the empire imperialism, and how did it change? What were the circumstances that made you produce knowledge like you're doing today for use value towards emancipation, emancipatory struggles, picking up on historical materialism and the Marxist tradition? So, yeah, thank you.
That might be enough for the next 15 minutes, unless you want to take another question from in the room, because it doesn't look like there's another one online.
Okay. I think we can take
So you want to take another one or two?
Yeah, Lima's got a question.
We'll just try to do it quick, because we have about 15 minutes.
Okay.
I can be as quick as possible. My question is sort of, I guess, profoundly pragmatic. And I rarely find myself in the situation where I'm trying to defend the DSA. It's something I don't want to commit myself to, but I will for a second, which is that one of the things that I find in organizing with the DSA useful or practical about culturalist, if we're going to use that term, culturalist theory, is that it makes organizing easier. It makes a problem that people have with sort of leftist, Marxist, orthodox discourse. It makes what is, I will claim, a leftist organization seeking to seize state power more approachable for a broader swath of the working class, because it complexifies sort of a class reductionist account, which I'm not satisfied with as a term, but I'll say here. And that, I think, speaks to some other academic accounts where you use Foucault to complexify Marx, or you use Heidegger to, again, just to take two examples, to complexify Marx. And so I wonder if you could perhaps speak to what this is a question for either of you, what the pragmatic benefit or not of making use of culturalist theory for practical worker organizing could be.
Let's see, where to begin? I want to start with Gabriel's questions when I remember the clearest. I am of the view, I'm going to not do the we, because again, a lot of the sort of fundamental work has been done in collaboration with Larry. The imperialism stuff is distinctive of myself, so I don't want to speak for Larry. But I am fundamentally of the view that there is no true use value society that could maintain itself with private property. Private property and a sort of use value society are mutually incompatible. Which, for the record, I think also clears up some confusion. There sometimes is like this idea that, for instance, people will often say, well, like, technically, right, all production prior to capitalism has sort of indirectly been like use value societies, like feudal societies use value. It's like, feudal societies were not producing for exchange value, which is true. Feudal peasants did not produce for exchange. They produced to, pay tribute to their, lords and so on. And I would say, well, yeah, but they did so unconsciously. This was not a rational aim. This was not, as Marx would say, right, production undertaken self-consciously. This is sort of the classic contrast, between the bee and the architect, right? It's not sort of undertaken, architecturally, so to speak. So I'm of the opinion that, with regard to the question of property, private property is not compatible with a use value society. So if the goal, to connect to a previous question, which I just will endlessly be answering for the rest of my life, to answer this question, if the goal is ultimately right, that upon sort of any significant achievement of class struggle toward what I would argue is a sort of rationally flattened society, which achieves human emancipation, the achievement of that human emancipation would include, as a requisite condition, the elimination of private property. I would like to know more about what you mean by power, because that concept can be so broad and elusive to me sometimes, such that I could better answer the question. Gabriel, would it be okay if I asked you to clarify that a bit?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking in terms of power within capitalist societies is principally at a foundational level mediated by property.
Oh, yeah.
So it's ownership and structures of ownership, and part of that was also just trying to get clear on, like, why is there that telos? Where does it come from? How is it related to structures of ownership, in short?
Yeah, I mean, to be perfectly honest with you, I think, this is maybe a good opportunity to introduce this, actually. It's just, I've been having this chat with you all and saying, like, here are these two critiques, and the two critiques exist. It's like, well, in the introduction of the book, there's actually 6 laid out. There are 6 critiques. You can find them in Marx, you can find them in various Marxists, and actually maybe this is a good opportunity to say there are like other critiques that I would say are good runner-ups to the telos critique that work really well in tandem. The critique of anarchic production, which is actually really prominent in the classical theories of imperialism, that of Lenin, Bukharin, especially that of Bukharin, even Hilferding, whatever his other limitations, is a good, sort of way of talking about this. It's like, I think, you could sort of think of the contrast of these two kinds of societies fundamentally in that way, where in one, power is fundamentally unconscious, irrational, and largely driven by a telos which is inhuman, in which we are alienated from our species being. That's capitalist society, in case you were wondering. And in the other, right, power is fundamentally restored to human beings to control and determine production in a rational means, according to rational ends, which would necessarily be egalitarian, and undertaken consciously. And for me, again, there are just like numerous passages where, Marx says this, I think, relatively transparently, if not in great detail, because, he didn't like recipes for the cookshops of the future, as you all well know, frustratingly. But, I think that's as close as we get anyway. So I would say that's maybe the quickest account I could give. How would I charge reductivism? This is always very interesting. I would say actually this is something I encounter a lot. Or rather I encounter sort of a weird, is the term obverse of this? I encounter a lot in this text. I can't recall the author's names at the moment, but in How the West Came to Rule, which was like really, really popular just like a handful of years ago. The authors sort of make this kind of really interesting assertion where they're just like, there are these people who want to define capitalism in one way and another, but who are we to define capitalism? It's so ridiculous to try to define capitalism by one logic or another. And to put it really plainly, if we can't define words, it's not clear to me why we should use them. I don't see myself as doing anything really that much more radical than trying to give a more rigorous analytical definition. I understand that many people probably feel, attached to defining capitalism exclusively in terms of wage-labor relations because Marx oftentimes has a tendency to do that. I think that's one reason, with which I think there are sort of 2 problems. I think problem 1 is it's just not the only way he does it. In the slides themselves, there's like a whole list of little citations. And I can tediously sort of point you to each page in appendix where he's like, well, he doesn't do it there. He does it a different way here. I could do that, which is a bit boring, frankly. And I can also say that Marx was a person, and it might have been more historically appropriate to foreground those relations given how incredibly novel their dominance was at the time. And in our own time, a different contradiction has sort of risen, it might be more sort of historically activated, so to speak. Historical materialism is precisely that, a thing which accounts for historical and material conditions with certain, obviously rule-bound, processes, So I would say, I know this is not your criticism, Gabriel, you were clear about that, but to the person who claims I'm being reductive, that's like, it's not clear to me how, giving a definition is any more reductive, than I'm simply justifying a competing definition that I think is a better one. I'm very clearly laying out why I think the other one is not, all that compelling, nor does it rise to the task, to say that. I don't know. Let's see. I don't know. Do you want to respond to Joel's question together? So I'm not sure if the DSA question is for both of us or not. I could answer. Do you want me to answer? Yeah, I'm happy to answer that one. Yeah. I think I'm of the view that there is not a terrible. Well, I don't want to say much about DSA generally because I don't have anything terribly pleasant to say. But so what I will say, here's what I will say. I'll make a philosophical point. That's the easier thing to say. What I will say is that I want maybe to invite you to think about what the inherent risks are in taking a position of pragmatic culturalism, insofar as we might view the existing landscape of liberal identity politics in which we are all forced to exist, whether we like it or not just on the internet, but even when we go try to touch grass, as like viciously reactionary for the most part. And I mean that like in every valence of the word, really. Like for the most part, every time we try to advance a cause, even a cause that's well-intentioned and overtly progressive in terms of its terminology, what tends to happen is it just sort of provokes a counter-identity measure, and that counter-identity measure is like increasingly vile. At least, again, granted, I'm speaking from my experience as a person who lives in the United States, and so, I don't want to universalize too much, but I get the sense that there's a logical continuity here, to the kind of identity politics that, might be prevalent in the DSA in other kinds of parties, but I won't generalize. So I think for me, the inherent risks of sort of, let me put it this way, inviting people in under the wrong pretenses, there's, I think, a certain risk that, the vicious qualities of identity politics, I think, become all the more apparent the more one tries to be strategic and tactical, and you think you're sort of doing the thing, and like people don't see what you're doing. But what actually happens, you alienate a large number of people, and then they become increasingly vicious, and now they're self-victimizing, and suddenly you have a very large quantity of fascists on your hands. Including people which, by the way, probably could have been won to your cause if you had not been identitarian about that cause, which is like a concern I have, again, as a person who lives in the U.S., right? So to put my cards on the table, like I actually am concerned about poor, working class, like whites who have been like actually legitimately severely exploited and who are now like enchanted with this monstrous populist figure who like could have been won to the left if they had not oftentimes like constantly been barraged with a discourse that said their identity made them a negligible member of that movement. So that risk to me seems disproportionately high. But perhaps Jennifer has a better, more nuanced take because she sort of tends to work on this thing with a bit more grace than I do. So I don't know. Yeah.
I mean, I was going to agree with you. I don't see any practical utility to culturalism precisely because it points us to, if you're explaining that the problem with the social conflicts that you're trying to address are these, just that people have bad ideas or that it's their cultural disposition that is at the source of these, that doesn't give you any tools for identifying where that cultural disposition of those ideas come from or how to change them. So I share that opinion with you. To the question of, we have to leave in 4 minutes, so I'll be quick. Gabriel's question about, Gabriel's question about fascism. I think why does it take this particular form? Why do we see a kind of the U.S. doing this, fascism by proxy has to do with it, becoming the global imperial hegemon at the same time, like in the wake of Nazism, in the wake of, and in the context of the spread of the, discourse of human rights, and that the U.S. is, as it takes on this position of leading imperial power, it's also presenting itself as the antithesis of fascism, right, and spreading this, of course, this like myth of U.S. political culture that the U.S. is like responsible for defeating fascism, which it wasn't, or the idea that it is going to be the promoter of human rights and spreading democracy around the world. That's how it's presenting itself as as leading as a superpower.
but at the same time still is requiring its this constant attack against development in the third world, and the super exploitation of workers in the third world. So I think it is doing that by maintaining this kind of liberal cover of the U.S.'s form of liberal imperialism, and then doing a lot of this sub rosa. And then just briefly the question of my own development, which is a long story, but I guess I just do want to say that I was really educated in the POMO, post-colonial subaltern studies. That was taking classes with Homi Bhabha, and these people were all Barbara Johnson. This was the people who were formed me at the level of college, and then a lot of this also through grad school continued to be the milieu in which I was in. So it's been a very long process for me to develop this critique that is very much a self-critique, and very much an effort to try to understand the history of my own education. And a lot of that just had to, the kind of questions that would raise for me, why are all these people so against development? Why is everybody against taking state power, were questions that were kind of forced to me by just seeing what's going on in the world, and seeing, I think, having, witnessing coup after coup, or the kind of imposed de-development, and really seeing a lack that a lot of the intellectual tools I had been given didn't provide me any useful resources for understanding these things. I was also very influenced by Western Marxism, of the kind of type that itself has a lot of anarchist strains and more libertarian strains, and a lot of the sort of anti-statist versions of Western Marxism. And really, honestly, I think for me, especially seeing the trajectory of the pink tide, and seeing the U.S.'s continual counter-revolutionary violence against any kind of efforts at national self-determination, really changed my idea of the utility of these very anti-statist forms of thinking. So I think we're going to have to wrap it up here, unfortunately. But thank you so much for being here.